All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on geography and where you are. I'm super excited to welcome you to today's Landscape Conservation in Action webinar, and really thrilled to welcome Jaimie and Seamus to share on their collaborative capacity work. My name is John Peterson. I'm the director for the Network for Landscape Conservation, and I'm joining from Western Massachusetts, where but before we get started and before I introduce Jaimie and Seamus, just wanted to take a moment to say a quick word from the network. The Network for Landscape Conservation was launched in 2011 to really be that national umbrella group and leading voice for collaborative landscape conservation and stewardship. And in so many ways, our work really is focused on connecting people to ideas and innovations, and perhaps most importantly to one another. And so in that context, I really think of the network as a community much more than an organization. And I see this network as a community that's connected by shared work, the work of collaborative landscape conservation and stewardship, and a shared desire to see that work done better, more effectively. And one of the conversation spaces where we have seen community members come together and really explore around is what is needed to allow for partners to come together and work effectively in the spaces between organizations. What are the collaborative capacities that collaboratives, networks, partnerships need to be effective in reaching for shared goals that exceed the capacity of any single individual or organization to reach on their own? And so in that context, really excited to be able to introduce Jaimie Baxter and Seamus Land, who have spent the last year plus really digging into the question of what is the connection between collaborative capacity and landscape outcomes on the ground, to share their perspectives and some of their findings that emerged in a white paper that was published just before the start of the year, or turn of the year. As we get started, we're going to share a Slido that has just a couple of questions that will help us orient to the conversation and presentation that Jaimie and Seamus will be presenting. And then just a word on logistics. We'll spend about 25 minutes or so hearing from Jaimie and Seamus on their findings and the work that's emerged from their white paper. And then we'll save space for question and answers with Jaimie and Seamus. And then depending on timing, we may invite folks to move into breakouts to pick these questions up and explore them a little bit more deeply with one another. And so certainly acknowledge that folks might have to navigate at that point, but we'll sort of see how the flow of conversation moves. But with that, Jaimie and Seamus, I'll invite you maybe to kick off the Slido and get started there, and move into the presentation. And I'll ask you both to introduce yourselves, and then maybe also introduce Tawny Robertson too, who is on deck to facilitate a breakout session if we move in that direction at the end.
Great. Thanks, John. I'll go ahead and kick off, and then I'll pass it over to Seamus and Tawny. Well, hello, good morning, and good afternoon, everyone. As John said, my name is Jaimie Baxter, and I am so thrilled to be here today and to see 134 people and more joining this conversation. We're really excited to share our work with you today. I'm currently working with the National Forest Foundation, but that's relatively new for me. My role is actually as a collaborative capacity program manager, so I get to think about this work every day, and I'm really excited to be able to do that. a big part of the reason why I was able to get this job was through this research fellowship that I did with the California Landscape Stewardship Network and the Stewardship Network. So I'm really thrilled to be sharing a little bit about that work today. I'm calling from Bellingham, Washington, the forever homelands of the Coast Salish peoples and on the unceded territories of the Lummi Nation and Nooksack tribe. Really grateful for your participation and looking forward to the conversation. I will pass it over to Seamus Land.
Thanks, Jaimie. And yeah, so good to see you all. Well, I guess see your names here and be able to share to you the findings that we have worked for over a year, as John said, to bring forward. I'm calling in from Missoula, Montana, from campus of the University of Montana on the Aboriginal territories of the Salish, Kalispel, and Kootenai people. And you know, for us to present today with the Network for Landscape Conservation, you know, there's so much support that they've provided to the field and to our work in particular. And this really feels like a fulfillment of our goal, which is making this information oriented towards practitioners and to the growth of the practice. So really excited to share what we came up with through the hour today. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tani.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tani Robertson, Director of Southwest Decision Resources. We're an independent facilitation group based in the Southwest and do a lot of work with designing and supporting, facilitating place-based collaboratives. And I had the pleasure of serving on the advisory team for the study that you'll hear about shortly. And I'm calling in from Tucson, homelands of the Tohono O'odham and Pasquayaqui peoples. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Tani. So to kick us off, we are going to share a link in the chat, and then I'm going to go ahead and swap my screen and present this Slido. We're really interested to hear from you and get to know you all a little bit, and interested to hear about what you're most interested in discussing or learning during today's presentation on collaborative capacity. So a very broad question, but we thought we would pull it over to the group to see what you all are thinking about this morning. So if you're unfamiliar with Slido, you can just go ahead and open that link and it should take you to this format here. You could also use the QR code in the upper left. And we'll give folks a few seconds to populate. Great, seeing a lot of requests for defining collaborative capacity, best practices for inclusion and equity, national support for collaborative capacity. These are all wonderful. I hope we address at least a sliver of these wonderful ideas. If not, they'll be fodder for future work. So I have a few more participants typing. Give it about 30 more seconds. Long-term management of collaboration. Lessons learned, great. And how can we make it attractive to potential partners? Really wonderful questions. So hopefully this feels like you're in the right place. So we're excited to share some of our lessons learned with you today. We have one more Slido question for you, which is actually turning one of our research questions to this group, actually. So go ahead and put this other link in the chat. And it really is about understanding how you would describe collaborative capacity. And I know there are many requests for us to define collaborative capacity, but curious in 1 to 2 words how how you would actually, if you were asked to define collaborative capacity, what would you actually say?
And we're not completely dodging the question. We will share some information on this, but this is really the approach we took in the study, is trying to understand across the field how people are describing and defining collaborative capacity. So we're excited to kind of keep that energy going and pull from you all through this slideshow. And I will, Marcel, I will share in the chat.
Great. Seeing some great words here. Co-creation, shared responsibility, power in numbers, synergistic, it's a good word, partnerships, money, growing pie, ooh. Equitable access, definitely, common purpose, radical, investments, yeah, and if you're having any trouble with the Slido, feel free to just type in the chat. Excellent. These are all beautiful. Stronger together. Yeah, great. A lot of energy around co-creation, definitely resources in the form of money at times, sharing resources, listening. Wonderful. Well, thanks for participating in that. It was really great to see and hear from all of you before we start talking at you. So I'm going to go ahead and swap my screen again and hop on over to our presentation so we can go ahead and get started. All right. So as we briefly mentioned, I think both Seamus and I were grateful enough to be research fellows with the California Landscape Stewardship Network and the Stewardship Network over a 15-month period, starting in 2022 and ending just the end of last year. This was a new endeavor for the California Landscape Stewardship Network, and we embarked upon a really collaborative research endeavor, which you're going to hear about. The California Landscape Stewardship Network, if you're not familiar with them, they facilitate peer learning opportunities and really focus on addressing barriers for landscape scale conservation and stewardship efforts across the state of California, but they're also really connected to the national network, the Network for Landscape Conservation. So we are really grateful to them and for their support, as well as the Stewardship Network and the Resources Legacy Fund for funding this study. A little bit about the motivation for this research, just to take us back a little bit as to why we studied this. Collaborative conservation and stewardship experts estimated in 2018 that there were close to 500 collaborative landscape conservation and stewardship initiatives working across the country, and that number has likely expanded since then. We know that collaboration has proliferated in the past 20 plus years, seen in academic literature, but also in practitioner spaces. And this collaboration has proliferated in many different sectors as well. And while some places have seen investments in collaboration to achieve landscape scale and cross-boundary success, other places really haven't. Some successes can be drawn to like the Migratory Joint Ventures Program, which has supported collaborative regional partnerships to conserve habitat for over the past 30 years. The Forest Service's Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program has provided millions of dollars for collaborative landscape scale projects on and adjacent to national forests across the country. But we still see a gap in collaborative capacity for stewardship efforts at the grassroots level and in certain regions throughout the country. And even more, we struggle to see the institutionalization of collaborative practices across and within agencies and organizations. So a 2021 survey actually conducted by the Network for Landscape Conservation polled collaborative practitioners organizing and coordinating and participating in landscape conservation initiatives. And they found that respondents felt that their collaborative group struggled with insufficient funding for the collaborative capacity that really supports the on-the-ground project implementation. And they also found that respondents were really wanting more skills in measuring and evaluating the impact of collaborative conservation and stewardship. And your responses to this slide really demonstrate that, really wanting to understand the relationship between capacity investments and outcomes on the ground. Now, at the same time, the California Landscape Stewardship Network convened and surfaced really similar challenges within the state of California, and especially efforts really focused at the grassroots level within California. So they invested in research and had many conversations with state and federal leaders and created several resources, one of which you can see here, which was published in 2022, which included a framework that we actually employ in our research and that we'll describe later in this discussion today. With this and with the recent federal and even some state funding opportunities, there was really a call coming from practitioners and funders alike to continue refining our understanding of needs and really find ways to articulate those needs to funders and legislators. We also recognize the importance of keeping an eye on the new voices that are popping up in these collaborative spaces and really trying to refine our shared understanding and our use of language for collaboration. And our research today, we want to really emphasize is that we're here to share some validating messages, hopefully, that this work shouldn't surprise you. In fact, we hope it resonates with you as practitioners who live and breathe this work. So with that, we're really excited to dive into the rest of our work today. Just a bit of a roadmap. We're going to share some background literature that we reviewed as a part of this study. We're going to describe our research methods, some of our findings, and then also the recommendations that we included in our white paper. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Seamus.
Yeah, thanks, Jaimie, for laying that great foundation. So one of the things that we want to do as we present our findings is really take a look back, because it's really important to also reflect on what values are we using, what lineages are we using to advance the field and grow the field, where have we come from, and what are we using to move into the future. So we want to turn to the lineage of our research and what we looked at. One of the main initial, inspirations for our work was a sense of the collaborative governance literature. And, collaborative governance has emerged as a way to fill governance gaps, has its origin sort of in conflict resolution and stakeholder engagement. And it attempts to address complex issues across political boundaries, scales, sectors. But again, it's that need to fill the gap in governance. And really, in a lot of ways, it often fills the gap in imagination and what we are able to accomplish together. So we looked at a lot of the collaborative governance literature, but we turned to the landscape stewardship literature. And this is sort of two parts. There's the landscape scale, which has its origins in transboundary science, like the migration ecology, watershed management that you're all familiar with. And a lot of people are forwarding it as the scale of relevance for understanding social and ecological systems at a scale where we can understand important flows of materials, people, culture, but also be grounded enough to look at one another in the eye and perhaps know each other in a deeper human way. And then as well, this idea of stewardship has been a shift that we've seen coming for a long time. I think, traditional conservation has been known to somewhat silo humans and nature in that Western academia has done the same. And there's this move and this shift to recognize the interconnectedness of humans and nature, and also affirmatively take part in those social and ecological systems. So stewardship is the notion that we can take a positive role in the management and the kind of participation in these ecological systems. So on the side of the literature, we're looking at social and ecological system theories, and so this landscape stewardship notion, it really pairs with that idea of large transboundary collaborative governance. And for practitioners like a lot of you, this shouldn't be anything new. The innovations and accomplishments have really outpaced the academic research throughout the history of collaborative landscape scale stewardship and conservation. But at the same time, as Jaimie mentioned, there's this significant lack of investment in key moments, key places that have hampered collaborative processes. And so this is fairly well documented at this point, and there's this need to understand it more holistically in the academic literature, and then also continue to forward these innovations in the practitioner community. And our work attempts to sit at the intersection of those two things. So as Jaimie mentioned, there have been these emergent practitioner frameworks, and we turn, as Jaimie also mentioned, to the California Landscape Stewardship Network's framework, which they put forward in recent years. And as it was asked in the chat, it is referenced in our study, but it also can be found, that paper that you saw the first page of in Jaimie's slide is also on the California Landscape Stewardship Network's website, and it's well worth a read. But looking at this practitioner framework, just briefly to see where we've come from, the authors of that paper saw the need to communicate what collaborative capacity is, what collaboration really is, to people who are maybe more familiar working in a traditional organizational context. So on the left, you see a nonprofit capacity framework taken from a widely used, widely recognized organizational capacity model from McKinsey & Company. And they translated that over into a collaborative context. So they have these 6 collaborative capacity elements, and those, we'll get into the detail of those elements as we go through this presentation. But you can see that there's these structural and then there's these binding elements that are important and fundable within collaborative spaces. And some of you asked for a definition. One of the simple definitions that we turned to, put forward by Dr. Amy Mickle from the California State University, Sacramento, she defines it as a collaborative ability to perform. So it's a simple, broad definition encompassing of a lot of different elements, which is really where we dove in. And this practitioner framework was, in a lot of ways, the inspiration for our research fellowship. And when we were hired, the door was open to study these elements as they framed them up. And one of the big goals was to determine its relevance across the country in practice. And so that's really what we did. Some of these insights taken from California initiatives, California experiences, we took a broader view and looked across the country and tried to understand the state of the practice today and whether this was actually being seen and understood on the ground. So I'll turn it over to Jaimie to tell us a little bit about the methods, and then we'll get back to those capacity elements as we go into our findings.
Great. So our approach to this, we knew that we only had about a year to do the research study and also write this white report. And so with limited time and also just thinking about the scope of asking the question around how do practitioners across the country, not just based in California, really think about collaborative capacity, we decided to take a really broad approach and look at a qualitative and exploratory research framework. So before jumping into our methodology, really wanted to acknowledge the advisory team that supported the development of the research questions and our methodology and supported all of our writing in this process. Our advisory team was made up of a diverse group of folks from academia to practitioners and to those who have been actually hands-on working with landscape stewardship efforts for many years. So this is our group featured in this picture here, minus Lisa Brush with the Stewardship Network. She was unable to make our retreat, but we were able to gather in May of 2022 and really dive into a lot of the data that we had collected and really work on themes and make a plan forward for how we were going to represent those themes in our white paper. So a huge thank you to Dr. Patrick Bixler from the University of Texas at Austin, Lisa Brush from the Stewardship Network, Dr. Wiley Carr with the National Park Service, Sharon Farrell, who's with the California Landscape Stewardship Network, Sean Johnson from the University of Montana, Joanne Marquetta, who was a former executive director of Tahoe Regional Planning Agency, who's now with Zephyr Consulting Company, Dr. Amy Mickle, who you heard her definition of capacity just a second ago, and then Tani, who's on the call. So with the advisory committee's support and also thinking through the lineage that Seamus really just shared of collaborative capacity research from academia and practitioners, we were really curious to ask these two questions. First, how do collaborative stewardship practitioners in the US define and describe collaborative capacity and its elements? We were also interested in what does increased collaborative capacity really allow practitioners to do? And without that capacity, what are they unable to do? So really trying to look at the inverse and positive relationship between collaborative capacity and outcomes on the ground. So with those questions, we really saw our methods in three different buckets. We performed an academic literature review as traditional academic study, but we also reviewed several pieces of gray literature, including grant reports and requests for proposals, really trying to understand how funders were describing collaborative capacity when they were putting their grant awards and requests for proposals out, and also seeing how collaboratives were reporting on those outcomes once they received that capacity funding. So that was a large portion of our work, which also informed a lot of our interview questions and focus group questions. So we held 27 different interviews, semi-structured interviews with US-based collaborative landscape stewardship practitioners and experts. And then we held 3 focus groups with funders specifically, asking pretty similar questions around defining collaborative capacity, and also looking at how they were describing the outcomes that they saw from the practitioner perspective and the funder perspective. We then took all of that data and did a large data coding process, and Seamus and I did that collaboratively. So we were really like in step the whole time with this research process, which was a really interesting experience. And I think we really felt like we both saw a lot of the data and the themes emerge in lockstep. So that was a really interesting process. And I'm going to let him share a little bit more about our findings.
Yeah, Jaimie, you just described it as an interesting process. I wonder if there's something that you need to share. No, it was a great process, and we learned so much from each other and about the data as we dove in. And we're going to share just kind of our basic structure. And there's so much more to share that I hope you'll look at the white paper for some of that detail. But first off, we have this sort of logic model that connects the dots. And that's a big part of what we're bringing forward today, that there's this relationship between elements, which we can invest in. It creates a space and allows for these collaborative activities, which is what you all on this call do every day. And then that suite of activities creates the space for better, more durable landscape scale stewardship outcomes. So we'll get to the outcomes shortly, but I want to take you through some of these elements here. But it's all within that logic model, and we'll share a framework that brings that forward as well. This is the meat of the study. These are the critical elements that hopefully aren't entirely new to you, but hopefully they resonate, and we bring them forward as kind of a laundry list that again enables the activities that create landscape scale outcomes. So here we have collective purposes and goals. These are the mission and vision statements, really the main goals of a lot of these collaborative initiatives. And some describe them as a narrative of what people are doing and why they're working together at all. And it's often described as the glue that holds a collaborative initiative together. People also mentioned shared strategies and priorities. Those are those strategic plans and work plans that help you carry out the work. It's really who is doing what. It provides the priorities to ensure maximum funding and maximum benefit. It's the efficiency of these collaborative initiatives that's often touted. Next up, we had people mention across the board collaborative practices, skills, and tools. That was described as kind of a collaborative mindset by the California Landscape Stewardship Network. It's often more intangible. It's the care, the commitment, the patience, and often even the emotional capacity of coordinators and facilitators in this work. But it's intangible, but really it is measurable in certain ways in social science evaluation, and it can be increased through trainings and mentorship. So it's a really important part of this work that I think a lot of us are aware of, but naming it as a capacity element shows the need and hopefully the clarity for increasing investment in this regard. The systems and infrastructure was also really crucial. That's just internet, the buildings, the space to meet, the places to have coffee and talk about this work, software, meeting supplies. It's one thing to want to work together, and it's another thing to have a data sharing platform that works with agency partners. And it's really tricky often, but it's crucial to enable those logistics of working with one another. The decision-making structures are also really important. That's how does a group, an initiative, a partnership work together, whether it's consensus or voting or somewhere in between. It's protocols, agreements, whether the groups have a steering committee or work different breakout working groups. There are varying structures that were mentioned, and there's no kind of perfect model, but having this decision-making structure and committing to this as an element was really important for all of the partnerships that we interviewed. Coordination capacity is a big one, and it also is mentioned across the board. That's the staff, the people that do the work, facilitators, coordinators, development directors, communications officers. And, you know, on the side of the coordinator, which is such a common job title, you know, it's someone who wakes up every day thinking about the partnership, the person who maintains the calendars, creates and manages agendas, brings people together. And that's just so important for the health and, you know, the durability of a collaborative initiative. We have context mentioned here. It was a theme that was prevalent throughout the interviews, but we actually pulled it out and we address it kind of independently and in a way that underlies all of these elements. Further along in this presentation, we'll return to it. But just to go through some of the activities, and again, this is the work that you all are likely just doing every day. And this is where a lot of these elements and outcomes come together. This is the tether. And I'm just going to go through them very quickly because, again, they should be familiar to you. Public engagement, outreach, newsletters, workshops, meeting and convening, so crucial to collaborative initiatives. Building relationships, again, something that we don't often focus on in frameworks like these for, you know, technical understandings of how landscape stewardship happens, but it's so important. Building trust over many years in order to do any sort of project on the ground. Landscape stewardship actions, of course, the planning, mapping, monitoring, and implementing of the work that often gets reflected. Communication, coordination of partners, evaluation, the reflexive activities that help a collaborative understand their own health, where they are in their growth phase, and how they're going to move forward to their goals. And then again, training and mentoring, seeing this as a growing field, something that's kind of growing in scope and developing. We need to understand how to train and mentor the next generations and build our own capacities within the work. So much more, again, in the elements and activities, but we wanted to touch on the context. These are all big categories again, but we just heard time and time again that and seeing this capacity framework building, the elements and activities are good to understand in the abstract, but really even in the US, it wasn't appropriate to ignore the diverse contexts that underlie all this work and that really shape the collaborative processes. So we have these contextual themes that we hope resonate with you, but they're also meant to sort of house a variety of really important comments in the interviews. As one coordinator shared, nobody does conservation on an empty stomach. Sometimes the first priority of a initiative that wants to do land conservation needs to consider housing or food security of the community that they're working in. And I think we really hope that this is fertile ground for contributions from other disciplines. This is where we're welcoming other academic disciplines to speak to this framework. It's a home for considerations that a particular partnership might be facing that isn't seen in the framework. where, for example, they're trying to understand why trust building between a tribal and environmental NGO is so difficult, or why it's just coming up as an unavoidable priority. So again, this is kind of our home for welcoming the other aspects that aren't reflected so much in the framework.
And building off of what Seamus was saying about context, of our 27 interview participants and our 16 focus group participants, we had a really diverse representation of geography across the US in our study. So these outcomes really reflect a wide diversity, also a wide variety of folks coming from collaboratives at various stages and phases. So from starting to building to maintaining, and a variety of sizes and sectors. So what you're going to see as far as our outcome themes is a pretty broad brush, not very specific, but pretty high level. And as our work was rooted in these practitioner and funder perspectives, we highlighted a lot of quotes in our white paper and in our research brief. So I selected a few that really illustrate some of these outcome themes, and I'm going to go through those in just a second. But just to give you a rundown of all the outcomes that we saw in this study. So first, accomplishing environmental goals and holistically planning and managing across landscapes. So definitely a high, we saw that a lot. A lot of folks said, yes, we saw a lot more cross-boundary planning and implementation of projects when people came together with greater collaborative capacity. We saw the improvement of interpersonal relationships in building social capital, the ability to leverage funding for the collaborative itself, but also the landscape scale efforts that they were working on. We also saw that individual organizations were able to achieve more of their goals through collaboration and through investments in capacity. We also saw that there was a stronger connection to a field of practice. So the Network for Landscape Conservation is certainly a home for that field of practice. And others were able to see how they fit into this greater network of folks, including influencing policy and advocating for more support. And then lastly, a really interesting finding was the intentional or unintentional dissolution of collaborative partnerships. So when capacity was funded or not funded, oftentimes we saw this tension around like when the collaborative partnership may dissolve intentionally for, achieving success, or unintentionally by like not having enough capacity to keep going. So just to dive deeper into a couple of these outcomes, I won't read the quote out loud, but I'll let you look at it. The interpersonal piece, throughout our interviews, practitioners frequently commented on how essential it was to fund training and skills building to increase both individual and organizational collaborative mindset, and to really focus on the purpose-driven relationship building that creates the social capital that can be activated later amongst communities to address additional collective needs and solve emergent problems, and really be adaptive, as we all know is so important in facing a lot of the climate-related challenges that we are experiencing today. Funders in the focus groups also validated the importance of improving and increasing interpersonal relationships within collaborative settings. And many really suggested that this needs to be documented, valued, and celebrated alongside the more commonly reported environmental outcomes. Related to leveraging funding, this will likely be obvious, but we found that adequate capacity investments, so investing in a consultant or coordinator or facilitator, really enabled these collaborative initiatives to pursue and acquire competitive grant funding that they could not have otherwise gone after. Funders also highlighted that investing a relatively small amount in collaborative efforts had compounding effects, in that they reported that these initiatives were more competitive for funding after they demonstrated strong relationship partners. Connected to the field of practice, we heard time and time again that peer exchange opportunities like this really strengthen practitioners' ability to resolve partnership conflicts, seek new funding opportunities, and acquire new tools for advancing their work. We saw that groups from different regions and and those that operate at various geographic scales are really, really necessary. So obviously the Network for Landscape Conservation is at a national scale, but we saw that the Western Collaborative Conservation Network that supports the West, or the Regional Conservation Partnership Program supports the Northeast, really important for building capacity and connective tissue amongst collaborative practitioners. Lastly, a bit about dissolution. So we found examples of dissolution of collaborative initiatives. An unintentional example is when a collaborative can dissolve for lacking certain capacity elements. So we heard this several times when coordination or facilitation capacity was lacking. And also that like trust building, that relationship piece, when certain collaboratives were unable to overcome a hurdle in that regard, dissolution happened. We also want to acknowledge that dissolution doesn't equal failure, and that sometimes the context, goals, and capacity available warrant the collaborative to shift, evolve, or go away. And that's a natural part of the evolution of collaboration. And with that, I'll turn it over to Seamus to give us an orientation to our adapted collaborative capacity model.
Yeah, thanks, Jaimie. And so, you'll see this familiar triangle in the center with the collaborative capacity elements and the binding elements that enable the activities, the suite of activities, as we've tried to represent here, that feed into the outcomes, all happening in context. So that's kind of the spiel of this framework, which of course is limited in certain ways, but we hope it's evocative and it can resonate with you, if only to connect the dots, connect the relationships between capacity elements through the activities to the outcomes on the ground. There's obviously so much more to this to explain and to bring forward that we've done in the white paper. But we hope this can support your work in just conceptualizing what you're doing day to day, and maybe how you might call for certain investments or call for certain activities when you're facing deficits of capacity or you aren't achieving your goals. I will say that, to understand this in a maybe more fluid, comprehensive way, I've sort of started to think of this as maybe a fountain. If you're looking down at a fountain, the context that underlies all this work comes up through the capacity elements, shapes and defines which ones are priorities, the character of each of those elements. The activities spill out into the outcomes, and the outcomes do have bearing and change the context. And so, for a collaborative or an initiative or a partnership that's trying to change the context, whether it's a community that's struggling with agricultural issues, or if it's some degraded stream, that you can see that the context does shape the elements and what's needed, but the outcomes can shape that context back. And so trying to understand this as a really fluid and holistic and grounded framework in practice. I think we want to make sure we have time for questions. So be sure you're asking questions in the Q&A box or on the Jamboard that John shared. We'll save those back, try to keep them for the Q&A time, but we do want to also share some of our recommendations that we've provided to the different communities that we're addressing.
So for practitioners, really telling the story of the work that you do, that includes all of the story. It includes the not so sexy parts maybe about capacity that are necessary for the work to continue. So really thinking about the relationship building, which is so important, the outcomes on the ground, obviously, but all the nuts and bolts that are necessary to make your work successful. We also suggest that you play with the framework that we have and really think about how the contextual elements that make your collaborative capacity or allow your collaborative group or partnership or network to really function. What are some of the difficulties that you're seeing in context, and thinking about kind of that holistic picture of what context your collaborative is situated in.
And so for funders, there's a lot of what's coming through in the Q&A is kind of how do we make this picture clear to funders? One of the things that we found is that funders are really aware of this, kind of the more holistic approach that we're advocating for, but they're also struggling to figure out how exactly do we put that into grant requirements, request for proposal, and how do we ask folks to evaluate themselves. One of the ways that we're advocating to kind of adjust the traditional model is to provide long-term funding that provides the essential elements for cross-boundary collaborative initiatives, kind of widening the scope of restrictions that's often imposed on these collaborative initiatives, to understand that there's that long-term need to build relationships, for example. Another thing is to integrate this capacity funding with project implementation funding. That's so often separated between the two, and it takes, a separate effort to build the funding for a coordinator who's going to actually wake up every day again and build that project from the ground up. We also hope for funders to look at peer learning and exchange opportunities as, again, essential to building that capacity of collaborative initiatives, and to connect the field and build a network that might share best practices across different geographies and different situations. And we also want to see more collaborative grant making to increase coordination, collaboration between funders and practitioners, to streamline and simplify grant application and reporting outcomes, and also build that sense of consistency and transparency and accessibility that's so difficult sometimes. And I think, we don't have necessarily there are great examples out there that are in our white paper. We don't have all the answers for how this should be done, but we do think that increasing the conversation and the dialogue between practitioners and funders will help folks understand the needs and build those protocols for evaluative metrics and reporting that people are struggling with right now.
And then related to researchers, we really would love to see the continued research of this type of work with the co-production model that we really used in our study, with thinking about practitioners and academics and up and coming, like mentoring graduate students and those that are new to the field. Really feel that was a really fruitful model for us. I see that there was a question in the chat around the potential for a quantitative study to branch from this. I think one of the things that we really acknowledge and see as a difficulty in quantitative work for this, really seeing the relationship between collaborative capacity and outcomes, is the really long-term need to understand environmental outcomes and social outcomes. These are slow processes. And so I think as far as a quantitative study could go, there could certainly be like an in-depth case study into a collaborative, really walking through the collaborative's work and understanding the levers of change from investments into outcomes on the ground, and potentially even doing some surveying of perspectives and also thinking about trust in a quantitative way, which people have done in the past. I think we cite a couple of those examples in our literature review as well. But really just, again, wanted to emphasize the benefits of this research model and suggest that people continue really exploring the outcomes and getting a little bit more fine-grained in those outcomes. Our themes were very high level. We know that there are many layers that live within those. So I think taking this research forward, that would probably be a good step, is to really understanding the details within our outcome themes. And then as far as next steps, our white paper and our research brief are out, and we are currently working on an academic article to be published, hopefully in the near future. We're giving presentations and webinars and sharing our work broadly. Several folks are engaging funders, from private funders to federal and state funders. And then just a note on some of my work, as the National Forest Foundation, the Collaborative Capacity Program, we are standing up a new financial award and technical assistance program with bipartisan infrastructure law funding, and really thinking about how to incorporate collaborative capacity and thinking about this framework specifically, and how we set up the funding mechanisms, but also how we ask people to report on successes. And I see that there are some questions in the chat about that we're happy to take. And lastly, just a huge thank you to all of you for joining us. We hope this is opening up a dialogue for future conversation and questions, not just in the next 7 minutes, but hopefully in the future too. Please feel free to reach out. And with
Yeah,
that,
thank you so
questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jaimie and Seamus. And Jaimie, just to underscore your last point there, that our hope is this is a conversation space that is opening. And what's so exciting is seeing 140 practitioners that are wrestling with these very questions and their own contexts coming together and thinking together around how do we resource the really critical, essential, foundational work of bringing together collaboration in a way that empowers collective impact. Please, by all means, continue using the Q&A box and the chat box to ask questions. And again, the Jamboards are in some ways an attempt just to foster that space for collaboration. So please utilize those, and we'll dig through those and see what's emerging there. But some just great observations and comments coming in. Jaimie and Seamus, I see one question emerging in a couple of different spaces around reflecting on the notion that it's coordination capacity, but it's the marriage, if you will, of coordination capacity, that human resource with the additional collaborative capacity of thinking about the skills, knowledges, and mindset. And in your interviews and your conversations with practitioners, curious to just hear you reflect on what you saw as those critical skill sets or missing skill sets that often exist within practitioners that folks are looking for through peer learning spaces, through grant funding programs that offer skills building. Any insights or observations that emerged from you on that front?
I'll maybe start to set the stage a little bit. I'm sure Jaimie has some good examples as well, but I think this field sits at the intersection of so many different lineages and disciplines, and that's confusing, complicated, but it's also a gift because we can look to fields that have been doing work around increasing those interpersonal capacities already for many years, and there's a lot of really good examples of just interpersonal engagement that can be increased, that trainings and mentorship that can increase our abilities to work with one another. And I think it's our work to put that into the context of these complex environmental challenges. And so again, I think just affirming that is part of our work. It's not a frustration that we have to deal with, at the end of the day. It is the core of this collaborative work, and it should be. And so that's kind of part of where we situate this within our work, but I'll turn it to Jaimie for maybe some more concrete examples.
I think that was a great response. I was just thinking about Amy Mickle, who was on our advisory team, has a paper called The 4 Cornerstones Collaborating Consciously, which I really think speaks to a lot of what Seamus said, and is a really simple way to start thinking about the more emotional and socio, really just acknowledging the emotional and social needs of being able to work with. But this is people work. This is definitely like landscape scale work, but also very much people work, and really recognizing the needs for thinking about humility and obviously all of the things that go with that. So I put that in the chat, and I recommend that as a resource.
Thanks so much, Jaimie. I didn't see you had put it in the chat, so I put it in the chat too. So now folks have 2 links to draw from.
Perfect.
Fantastic. I'm just flipping through the Jamboards. The Jamboards are so dynamic. I love to see that. And And the Michelle, your reflection on really seeking a space where we can continue this conversation and peer learning really resonates, and I think we hope to continue to use spaces like this as that opportunity. Jaimie or Seamus, I don't know if there's anything you're seeing in the Jamboards or in the chats that
There's one question early on, I think was one of the first questions that I think is really interesting. Was around how were strong partnerships or relationships demonstrated to funders in a way that funders really understood and appreciated. A couple of examples that come to mind were definitely letters of support. So like really asking for partners to provide key letters of support of how they were engaging in relationship. Typically you see that in an application, but also this was really interesting. Some people actually shared letters of support at the end of their grant term to say, like, this is the good that we saw out of our partnership and our individual perspective. Also actually a bright spot that we highlight in our white paper with a regional forest and fire capacity program in California is that they ask for the typical metrics around landscape scale outcomes, but they also ask their grantees to do an assessment or an evaluation of their collaborative's health and really have all of the partners participate in that. Which is a pretty big lift and a pretty big ask for each partner to do, but I think it was a really interesting way for them to reflect on the work that was done and to actually have the contributions of each partner laid out in a format that was you can compare to different collaboratives as well. And I think that that's a really good question to keep exploring and something that I'm certainly thinking about now in setting up this new program.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Jaimie, for pulling that one forward. That one had caught my eye too, and such a good question. I'm looking at the time, and we are at the top of the hour, and it's been such a fantastic discussion. Jaimie and Seamus, thank you so much for coming into the space and sharing your findings and the white paper. Thanks everyone for joining and participating in this conversation. It's been super fun to watch the Jamboards come alive a little bit. And so much space to explore. Looking forward to continuing to have this conversation space as part of our webinar series moving forward. We'll be announcing additional webinars in the coming weeks and look forward to staying connected. And two, just to underscore that the note that I saw in the chat around the desire to seek out these opportunities to connect and learn. Please be in touch. I feel like that is what's needed so much in this space. We collectively are wrestling with these questions and working in prevailing paradigms that aren't oriented to supporting and resourcing collaborative capacity. And this is definitely a space where we have a lot of opportunity to connect and work together and thinking about how we address that and shift paradigms in ways that really accelerate efforts on the ground in ways that are deeply needed. Thank you so much, everyone. It's always so fun to be in these spaces and really appreciate the conversation. Jaimie, Seamus, thank you again, and we'll look forward to seeing everyone again soon. Take care.